Good morning, everyone. It's a true pleasure to introduce Dr. James Applebaum for his grand round topic on neurology of politics. Dr. Applebaum is a private practice neurologist in the community. He's on staff at Providence Medical Center, and this is after completing many years ago, we're probably from the same generation, his training at University of Chicago and fellowship in neurophysiology back then. So Dr. Applebaum, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Damaski. I appreciate the chance to come and give a talk to you all. Dr. Barron sent out an email to every neurologist in the city asking for people to give a talk, and I got that email and said, oh, maybe this is my chance to pursue a little interest that I don't otherwise have a chance. I was a political science major at KU before I went to med school. I was planning to go to med school anyway, but I thought I'd do something a little bit different. And so this is my chance to fuse my areas of interest before an audience, so let's see how it works out. I do have some bronchitis, so I'm going to have to ask for some help. So is there anyone in the audience that drives a Prius and has a coexist bumper sticker on the back of their car that can read this for me? I really do need a volunteer.
Once upon a time, people lived in societies that were unequal and oppressive, where the rich got richer and the poor got exploited. Chattel slavery, child labor, economic equality, racism, sexism, and discriminations of all types abounded until the liberal tradition of fairness, justice, care, and equality brought about a free and fair society. And now, conservatives want to turn back the clock in the name of greed and God.
Anyone gnashing their teeth or weeping? Thank you very much. All right, now I need someone who drives a Hummer. Just a volunteer.
Once upon a time, people lived in societies that embraced values and tradition, where people took personal responsibility, worked hard, enjoyed the fruits of their labor, and through charity helped those in need. Marriage, family, faith, honor, loyalty, sanctity, and respect for authority and the rule of law brought about a free and fair society. But then liberals came along and destroyed everything in the name of progress and utopian social engineering.
So this is, thank you, Michael Shermer wrote this, just to illustrate an article. So, yeah, obviously there's some people in the room that agree with number one, some that agree with number two. And so I, over my life, have had arguments with people of the opposite political persuasion that I never won and they never won. I was never able to convince anyone to my view, and they could not convince me. Then later on, Facebook came along, and I've had interesting arguments on Facebook, and again, we've never been able to convince each other either. So I started pondering whether this could be a neurological disease that we could fix, or explain on a neurological basis. And I think it may be. We'll find out. Let's see what you think of some of these studies that I brought up. So first of all, now I'm a private practice neurologist, so I'm really not responsible for showing little anatomy slides and explaining it. But suffice to say that we have the amygdala, and it does have projections to the striatum and cortex through dopaminergic pathways. So I think dopamine is going to be a theme of my talk here. And this is the anatomic basis of those ideas. So the first clue that dopamine might be involved came out of this study. This is a study of the National Study of Adolescent Health. And they collected data through the 90s and early 2000s. And they formed a genetically informative sample of sibling pairs. And they looked in this study at the TAC1A polymorphism, which is in linkage disequilibrium with the DRD2, dopamine receptor 2 gene, which is on chromosome 11. And so they found 2,574 subjects that had genetic samples Prior studies have shown connection between the D2 receptor and formation of social attachments. And it's also involved in cognitive function. So the simple question that they ask of the subjects, do you identify with a political party? And so they found that with a number of alleles of this receptor gene, that you were much more likely with 2 alleles to be politically active than with 1. So a clue that dopamine receptors may be involved in political behavior. So the next study I want to show you is from Amadeo et al., and they published in 2007. Conflict monitoring is a general mechanism for detecting one's habitual response tendency is mismatched with responses required by the current situation. And it is involved with the anterior cingulate cortex to integrate these messages coming in from the external world. They use a go-no task. So the subject has to respond quickly to a frequently presented go stimulus, and then the go stimulus becomes habituated. But then on a small proportion of trials, a no-go stimulus appears, and then the subject is supposed to withhold the response. So any response conflict is typically associated with the anterior cingulate cortex, as measured on functional MRI or event-related potentials. So in this study, they record EEG from 43 right-handed subjects. 63% are female. And then these subjects reported their political attitudes confidentially on a -5 to +5 scale. On each of the no-go tests, they would either see the letter M or the letter W in the center of the computer monitor screen. And half the subjects were supposed to make a go response for the M and a no-go response for the W, and the other half had the opposite. So responses were registered on a computer keyboard, placed in the laps. They had a fixation point presented for 500 milliseconds. The target appeared for 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, and then a blank screen, and they had to respond within 500 milliseconds of the target onset. They would get a too slow message if the response exceeded the deadline, and incorrect feedback was given after erroneous responses. They gave them 500 trials. 80% were the go, 20% were the no-go. So I'd like you all to just kind of raise your hands when you see the go response. The go response is an M, and then don't raise your hands if you see the no-go. And I'm giving it less than 500 milliseconds, so just cheating. So. Oh, I saw someone. Okay. All right, so someone didn't get the no-go. So yeah, that you're supposed to suppress your response. Well, here's where it got very interesting. Liberalism. I don't know if I have a pointer. Yeah, here we go. Liberalism is associated with larger no-go response, error-related negativity, as indicated by the more negative scores, suggesting a greater neurocognitive sensitivity to response impact. Now, I'm not a statistician, but it seems like a pretty weird scatter, but they do have a regression line, and it does show this tendency for the liberals to have a higher negativity on this EEG monitoring. The waveforms, again, the liberals are at the top and the conservatives are at the bottom, so the waveform for correct go responses subtracted are shown for both liberal and conservatives. So the no-go response is the giving a bigger voltage for liberals than conservatives. And they localize this event-related potential to the anterior cingulate gyrus. They also do an N2 response map, and that again also is in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. So they conclude that the political orientation was strongly correlated with event-related negativity amplitudes, as well as with N2 amplitudes. Liberalism versus conservatism was associated with significantly greater conflict-related neural activity when response inhibition was required, the no-go task. The event-related potentials associated with correct go responses scored to correspond to the event-related negativity and no-go N2 were not related. So it was just the no-go response that was related. There was a larger amplitude also for the no-go trials, which were not related to any kind of accuracy with the go trials. This association suggests that a more conservative orientation is related to greater persistence in a habitual response pattern, despite signals that this response pattern should change, for example, on the no-go trials. So liberalism is associated with a greater neurocognitive sensitivity to cognitive conflict beyond what was observed from behavioral performance alone, and the results are consistent with the view that political orientation in part reflects individual differences in the functioning of a general mechanism related to cognitive control. Conservatism was associated with less neurocognitive sensitivity to response conflicts. In the behavioral level, conservatives are also more likely to make errors of commission, but the conservatives would presumably perform better on tasks which a more fixed response style is optimal. What do you guys think? Any comments yet? Okay, so another study, functional MRI study of motivated reasoning, partisan political reasoning, and this is the 2004 election. So we had Bush versus Kerry. They looked at partisans using functional MRI while reasoning about threatening information regarding their own candidate, the opposing candidate, and neutral controls. Motivated reasoning was associated with activations of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, that's showing up again, posterior cingulate, and lateral orbital frontal cortex. Motivated reasoning was not associated with increased neuroactivity in regions previously linked to cold reasoning, like the lateral frontal cortex. The findings provide the first neuroimaging evidence for motivated reasoning and implicit affect regulation or psychological defense. So here's how they did it. They got right-handed men, ages 22 to 55, described themselves as committed Republicans or Democrats. Then they gave 6 sets of statements regarding each of the following targets: George Bush, John Kerry, and a neutral male target without strong perceived ties, such as Tom Hanks, Hank Aaron, William Styron. And the initial statement on slide 1 was a quote from the target, and then they gave a contradictory statement suggesting that the target's words and actions were inconsistent. Then they asked the subject to consider whether the target's statements and actions are inconsistent with each other, and then they would answer that. Then a next slide, rate the extent to which they agreed that the target's words and deeds were contradictory from a scale of 1 to 4, using a 4-button pad. Then they gave an exculpatory, or a statement that made the target not so bad as the first statement, that explained the inconsistency. Then they asked to reconsider their feelings, maybe not quite as bad. And then they again asked them to rate using the 4-point scale. So kind of a complicated study. So here's what they showed for Bush. I'm not going to do my Bush accent, sorry. First of all, Ken Lay is a supporter of mine. I love the man. I got to know Ken Lay years ago. Do you all remember Ken Lay? He headed Enron that had the big crash right after 2002, I guess. So he likes Ken Ray. When I'm president, I'm going to run the government like a CEO runs the country, just like Ken Ray and Enron. I'm going to do just like that. Now, then they show the contradictory statement. Well, Mr. Bush now avoids any mention of Ken Lay and is critical of Enron when asked. So get mad at Mr. Bush, right? And then they give an exculpatory statement. Exculpatory meaning to clear his name. People who knew the president report that he feels betrayed by Ken Lay and was genuinely shocked to find that Enron's leadership had been corrupt. So we feel better about Bush. Now here's Kerry's statements. In 1996, Kerry told a Boston Globe reporter that the Social Security system should be overhauled. He said that Congress should consider raising the retirement age and means testing benefits. I know it's going to be hard, he said, but we have a generational responsibility to fix the problem. But then, in 2004, he's saying, oh, no, I don't want to do that. I'm never going to tax or cut benefits to seniors or raise the age of eligibility for Social Security. So, politician, right? But the exculpatory statement is economic experts now suggest that, in fact, Social Security system will not run out of money until 2049, not 2020 as they had thought, so maybe it was okay to change your mind due to the change in the facts. Okay, so what we see here is Democrats are really good at catching Bush, changing his mind, and the Republicans in turn are very good at catching the Democratic contradiction, and then for the neutral contradiction, they're pretty much evil. Now another little interesting side bar is Democrats are pretty good at finding their own contradiction significantly better than Republicans are at finding their own contradiction. Okay, so then they do the functional MRI contrast analysis. So functional MRI, from what I understand, you can do two ways. One is you have a region of interest that you already know about, and then you just zone in on that and can see. But what they have to do here is the second kind, which is a contrast analysis where they subtract out a situation so that only the active situation shows. So again, I'm a private practice neurologist. I don't know too much about the science. Is it kind of hedging the bets to do it that way? I think it's not quite as compelling as if they would just find these regions without doing the contrast analysis, but I don't think we have good enough MRIs to tease out these functional differences without doing the subtraction study. So that's how they did it. Now, first thing they looked at, they compared the same party candidate responses to neutral condition during the contradiction block. So this is where the Democrat sees his candidate messing up. What does the brain do to ease that contradiction? The second comparison is the contradiction statement to the exculpatory statement. So what does the exculpatory statement do to help ease the contradiction? This third one is very complicated, but they take the same party targets minus the neutral process and minus the exculpatory block. So this is where the same party is being shown to what areas of the brain are activated to defend your same party candidate. So what we see is that this is the subjects were confronted with the contradictory information regarding their own party's candidate versus a neutral person. So a Kerry supporter is seeing Kerry apparently changing his mind and lying, and what we see is prefrontal motor cortex, the good old anterior cingulate gyrus, the ventral median prefrontal cortex, and the posterior cingulate gyrus, and the precuneus, all being activated when you're confronted with a statement about your own party candidate. And the key point that I take away from this is that here's all this cortex where we think that we live, where we think we do our political reasoning, where get on Facebook and you're obviously using your higher cortical functions to make these brilliant arguments to your friends who are of an opposite political persuasion. What the study shows is that you could be a rat and do the same areas of the brain. A rat would have these same areas, right? Now this is what happens when you see the opposing party. And I can see where this would be. I mean, when you see the opposing party making a mistake, I mean, that definitely activates your primitive brain functions because you just get all like this, right? You know, GD blank, doing blank. So, and yes, the posterior cingulate, precuneus, posterior parietal cortex are involved. No nice frontal lobe, what we think is our human reasoning centers, none of them are activated. So just to compare, here's when you see your own candidate messing up, here's when you see the other candidates messing up. You see this big representation in the posterior cingulate. Nice, I think Carl Sagan called this the reptilian brain, the nice activation of the reptilian brain, and no higher cortical functions are being activated. So I thought that was very compelling. Now they do what lights up when you have the responses, when you see the contradiction versus the exculpatory statements. So greater activation when partisans were reading emotionally threatening information relative to the non-threatening. So they're subtracting out when they got the non-threatening information. And again, you're seeing the lateral orbital frontal cortex, the medial orbital frontal cortex, the perihippocampal gyrus, and the precuneus. So again, primitive reptilian brain areas are being activated, nothing logical, nothing. So, and then the neural regions that are significantly more active when subjects were processing threatening versus exculpatory information for their party's candidate. So yeah, when you're attacking my candidate, I'm going to activate, I'm going to think about it and think logically and come up with a logical answer. No, that's not what's happening. It's all primitive reptilian brain that's being activated. So consistent with prior studies of partisan biases and motivated reasoning, when confronted with information about their candidate that would logically lead them to an emotionally aversive conclusion, partisans arrive at an alternative conclusion. This process was not associated with activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as in studies of cold reasoning and conscious suppression. Rather, it was associated with activation of the lateral and medial orbital prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, insula, posterior cingulate, contiguous precuneus, and parietal cortex. Neural information processing related to motivated reasoning is different from reasoning of in the absence of a strong emotional stake in the conclusions reached. So definitely using a different, more primitive part of the brain when we're thinking politically. Okay, so this is Colin Firth, who was in the King's Speech, and he was on the BBC as a guest host, and they were just kind of chatting about brain function, and Colin Firth was saying he wanted to find out what was biologically wrong with people who don't agree with me and see what scientists had to say about it and what they actually came up, and they actually came up with something. So he went to his friends at the Queen's Square and he paid for the study, and they had this database of MRI scans where they had them all tabulated of the brain volume studies, which a lot of us are familiar with from other places where the studies are used. So they did 90 young adults, 61% female, and they had them confidentially. I like all these studies because they're kind of simple. So just a 5-point scale, very liberal to very conservative. And then they do the voxel-based morphometry analysis. The scales are 1 to 5 again, where 5 is conservative. And they found increased gray matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex was significantly associated with liberalism. There's that anterior cingulate again. And regressed out potential confounding variables of age and gender. So that it's not due to age or gender, at least according to what they say. found that increased gray matter volume in the right amygdala was significantly associated with conservatism. There's that amygdala again. No significant correlation was in the left amygdala. These were all right-handers, so maybe if they did left-handers, it'd be opposite. Then outside these regions of interest, they conduct a whole brain analysis. Didn't find regions that showed significant correlation with political orientation with appropriate correlations for family-wise error at a threshold of p less than 0.05. I don't know what family-wise error is, so tried to look it up, couldn't find it. But I'm just a poor little private practice neurologist that you guys invited, so be nice. Had a more lenient statistical criterion, uncorrelated, uncorrected, and cluster size, so a little bit larger areas of interest. They found some other gray matter volume abnormalities between conservatism and liberalism. The conservatism had a bigger left insula and the right entorhinal cortex, and they didn't find any other regions of interest for liberalism. And they do a replication study with 28 new participants, did the same procedures, and they said they replicated their correlations. So here's the data. Now, to me, the error bars kind of overlapping, but the regression line does seem to show that the liberals had a bigger anterior cingulate and the conservatives had a bigger right amygdala. Do we trust this study? Hard to say. Sure got a lot of publicity, though.
Berkeley's a liberal, right?
And the liberals, of course, did the study. Red brain, blue brain. This is another study. This is to look at the processes in Democrats versus Republicans doing the same task. And this task was a decision-making, risk-taking task. And those of us that treat Parkinson's and see the side effects of our dopamine agonists causing them to gamble more. I mean, so again, the theme that I'm trying to express is dopamine's kind of the theme here, right? So gambling is a dopaminergic pathway, I think. Or I'm simplifying, obviously. There's other pathways involved, but it's a big part of it. And we're all aware of how the dopamine agonists can increase gambling behaviors, right? So anyway, they take these individuals, presented with three numbers in ascending order, 20, 40, and 80 for 1 second each. So they only have a brief time to make a decision. And they have to press a button on the number 20, they'll get 20 cents. But if they wait till there's a 40 or an 80, then they are gambling and they can either gain 40 cents or lose 80 cents, depending on what they press. So they can take a safe payoff or a risky payoff, their choice. The probabilities of losing 40 or 80 cents were calibrated so that there was no expected value advantages to choosing those numbers during the task. They wouldn't be able to game the system. Then they just took the available party registration records. They didn't ask the subjects, and they had these data already, and they just took the party registration records so they could tell if there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans. They're using functional MRI again, and they already had the Cannae study, so they were zoning in on the right amygdala, left insula, anterior cingulate cortex, and the right entorhinal cortex. So, so then they didn't have to do the comparison studies; they could just do the study of the region of interest. So this is a little more powerful, I think. Then they do the robust regression modeling. So I guess we're supposed to trust them, right? That they took out the age, income, political party, and the Tesla units of the magnet. So 4 brain regions implicated in risk and uncertainty: the right amygdala, left insula, right entorhinal cortex, and anterior cingulate cortex differed in liberals and conservatives. The amygdala is thought to be important for the processing of affective attributes involved in decision making. the insular cortex is involved in representations of internal body cues crucial for subjective feeling states and signaling potential changes in interoception state to possible decision-related outcomes, further intolerance of uncertainties related to posterior insula functioning. Intercingulate cortex is conflict and error monitoring, as we saw from the study of the go, no-go. So what do we find? Well, significantly greater activation was observed in the right amygdala for Republicans just doing this gambling task, whereas the Democrats are using their posterior insula, and there was no significance for the interrhinal or intercingulate, so those weren't involved in the decision-making. If they tried to use behavior to distinguish Republicans from Democrats, it was unsuccessful. So they're coming up with the same behavioral choices, but they're using different parts of their brain to come up with their responses, again implying that Democrats and Republicans or liberals and conservatives are wired differently. So this is showing that Democrats activate their posterior insula, and here's that nice right amygdala for the Republicans. So, and the error bars do not overlap. It looks pretty good data to this speaker. This is to prove that the behavioral differences are this. There's no behavioral differences. So, if they received a punishment in which they lost in a prior event, Democrats, Republicans do the same choice for the 20. Without prior punishment, Democrats and Republicans do the same 20 cents for with prior punishment. They do the same for the 40, where they could gain 40 cents, and with or without prior punishment, and the 80 cents with or without prior punishment. So they all were acting the same on the basis of behavioral responses. So another study that shows that that Democrats and Republicans seem to be wired a little bit differently. Finally, I want to show you a study from Jonathan Haidt et al. And his colleagues back from 2009, and he wrote this book called, and I'm blanking on it, I'll think of it later, that describes how the brain functioning between liberals and conservatives. So he approached this from an idea that there are 5 moral foundations that all societies base their morality on, and he, in prior research, found these foundations by studying Western culture, but also Indian subcontinent and Asian cultures that actually have a little bit different outlook, right? But they all had the same 5 moral foundations. Harm and care, so someone suffered. Fairness and reciprocity, so someone was denied his or her rights. In-group loyalty, someone did something to betray the group. Authority and respect, so someone showed a lack of respect, like burning the flag, say. Purity and sanctity, whether someone violated standards of purity and decency. And then he has a website called Project Implicit, and people can register there and then take these psychological tests. So he had 1,613 adults, 47% female, 53% male, median age 29, on this website. Then they report their political orientation on a 7-point scale, strongly liberal going to strongly conservative. Then they read, when you decide whether something is right or wrong, to what extent are the following considerations relevant to your thinking? Then they get 15 moral relevance items on a 6-point scale that they rate. The labels on these are never relevant or always relevant. So they would say 0 if they thought it was never relevant to their decisions versus 6 for always relevant. And they were supposed to be measures of concern related to the 5 foundation, and they could not have any kind of partisan political type of bent. So what he found was that the liberals, strongly liberals, really identified with just two of these moral foundations. So the liberals tended to be more worried about harm, someone suffered, and fairness, someone was denied their rights. And the conservatives, on the other hand, threw in the other three. I mean, they were still concerned about harm and fairness, but also in-group, loyalty to the group, authority, and purity. So the conservatives were much more likely to have these others, but they also still incorporated harm and fairness. So this was a study that showed that if you omitted the political implications and just did it on the moral scales, there was still a difference between liberals and conservatives, which I submit is probably related to the wiring of the brain. So political behavior may reflect differences in brain structure and function. The number of studies is quite small, and of course, but the theme is the liberals and conservatives have a differing thought processes for evaluating information as exposed by the gambling study that I showed you. But the question that we leave unanswered is what is cause and effect? Is this rewiring of the brain? Some of you may be familiar with the study where they took the London cab drivers that had to learn the streets of London, and they have to know each little landmark. Like there's a little bird on the wall, statue of a bird on the wall at this street and not on the other street. And so they were, and that study showed enlargement of the hippocampus, and the folks that, I think they had to spend 10 years learning this map of London so they could drive the cab. And of course they have the Uber drivers that just have a GPS and don't have to learn it. But anyway, there is brain plasticity, we all know. So what is cause, what is effect? Well, my feeling is, after trying to argue with people of the opposite political persuasion for 54 years, that it has to be hardwired. So what do you think? Well, before I just wanted to finish with a Doonesbury, because I figured if it made into Doonesbury, it must be real. So this is a Doonesbury strip from last fall. Wonder why so many GOP ads this past election played to your fears? Our Roland Headley explains. By evoking terrorism, Ebola, border security. Of course, we all know Gary Trudeau's outlook, right? Yeah. Ebola, border security, GOP spots use fear to motivate the base. Why? Well, it turns out conservative brain is unusually receptive to danger. And I really like his drawing of the brain. I think that's his story. Researchers have found that the right amygdala, the part of the brain that responds to threat, is bigger in conservatives than in liberals. So if you're a paranoid, gun-loving, right-wing birther, it's with good reason. You're likely packing an outsized amygdala. So, Roland, do authorities know why? Is it an alien implant? They won't say, Steve. They don't want us to know. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. I love the gambling study. Other studies, I mean, setting aside whether the imaging studies that they used for the ROI were in British political parties versus American, whether Democrat, Republican, versus do a real control. I'm curious whether there was any that had control groups where people who identified as neutral were then given a study and showed that change is phenomenal in their ability to execute those tasks based on whether they're engaged in behavior or not. So I understand they took, you're taking someone who is, that they looked back later and said this person is a registered Democrat.
Right.
What about people who say, I'm not, and how their decision process is affected by that task?
Yeah.
A control group.
I mean, this gambling study was done in the beginning just to see without the political thing in mind. So they did publish that. I didn't look at that study, but the nonpartisans, neutral, would be thinking with the same kind of basic areas of the brain. I don't know if they found a difference between nonpartisan and partisan.
And last thing, this speaks to your first one about the use of dopamine. Are there any experiments that you found where they really tested it by giving, say, cocaine or haloperidol to the people who were.
Yeah, I really want to do that study. I'd love to get in an argument with someone and see where they're coming from, and then just slip them some Haldol and see if they change. Or maybe Dr. Camerata could take out a bunch of amygdalas and turn them into.
We do it in epilepsy patients. Yeah.
They haven't changed any of their political persuasions that I'm aware
You
of.
don't think so? No.
I mean, they changed their religion. Though.
Yeah.
I think I want that to not be published.
Yeah. Questions or thoughts? Well, I had a lot of fun doing this. Gave me a chance to go back to some of my undergraduate roots, and and I realized these studies are kind of small, and the paucity of them, but I don't think there's a lot of money in being devoted to such studies. I mean, you don't have a pharmaceutical company
I
that's.
know Colin Firth funded the one study. Who funded the other ones? I'm just curious.
These were just, the Amadio study that did the functional. That was a NIH type of thing. It kind of tied in with his research that he was doing on behavior, but I was reading. There's a South Carolina. University of South Carolina, the state is supporting a political scientist there that's doing some of this stuff. So
DARPA funds it too. So, hey,
DARPA, yeah.
Yeah, there's a $6 or $7 million project going on at the University of Arizona right now to identify brain states associated with highly radicalized thinking and just those the same type of thinking who cannot be argued out of position, in the attempt to be able to identify educational interventions that they can use to counter that thinking. The reason why they're paying for it is in order to perfect interrogation techniques to talk people out there.
I thought maybe Harris was funding some of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, Bill.
So, I mean, what it seems like is people of one extreme versus another extreme, based on the last study, it seems like they prioritize certain moral values versus others. What's not to say, all these moral values are important. So it looks like everyone has their own, each group has their own perspective. So my point is, can we all get along? Is that...
Well, I've thought about that a lot, because after I decided that this is indeed a brain disease or a brain condition that I cannot change. I love to be able to treat it. I cannot treat it.
There's no right way, right?
Right.
We can't say there's one right way versus another right way.
It's totally based on what you're. I mean, I could look at the same article or those statements that I wrote at the beginning. I read one and I think, yeah, I kind of agree with that. It's a little extreme, but I agree with it. And the other one, I said, oh my God, that's really not true. I think these studies show that maybe we ought to just get along, and stop arguing, because we're never going to convince each other of the other's rightness. And maybe there's, until the last 20 years.
Or is getting along too liberal? Is that too liberal to get along?
Well, I mean, supposedly the liberals are better at identifying their own failings, as I showed in the one study, and maybe the liberals always want to get along, and maybe those big swollen amygdalas are pumping out dopamine and preventing conservatives from getting along. I'm not trying to divulge what my bias is, but
there are some people, some fairly high-profile people, though, who have made major shifts. I mean, from liberalism to conservatism and vice versa. It'd be interesting to study those patients.
TBI related?
No. He's got the coexist bumper sticker on it.
Churchill says, "Show me a young man who is not a liberal. I'll show you a man with no heart. Show me an older person that is not conservative. I'll show you a man with no brain." I mean, people do evolve as they get older. So.
Just one briefly. There's a lot of people who identify themselves as socially liberal, fiscally conservative. Do any of these people comment on that? Because a lot of people don't have just one straight way.
Right, we're more complicated than these studies show. As you saw from these studies, they tended to just a 0 to 5 scale. What are you? Self-reported. Although the one study they went by the party registration, and then you saw in the Canine study that there was the scatter. When you look at just the scatter and not with the regression lines, I mean, there was quite a bit of scatter, right? So I always remember being taught the regression lines are kind of way to finesse data that might not otherwise be finessable.
It's kind of interesting to think about this from a perspective of what is kind of more biologically, genetically inherent to these people versus what kind of developed over their childhood or over a period of time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they do twin studies and they do studies of siblings, and you'll see in a single family, one sibling is liberal, another sibling is conservative, and they both grew up in the same household. So, that's an indication that maybe it is hardwired. As we see in a lot of our other diseases, we're now seeing it's more biologic than environmental.
Just really briefly, I find it interesting. I grew up in Australia, so a liberal in Australia is a conservative here, because they're liberal,
right.
They're free market liberal, they're kind of
right, classic liberalism.
And a conservative, like conservation, in Australia they're very big on conservation in terms of the environment and mining and so forth. So it's actually completely flipped over.
Yeah, the British studies, they were using their definition of political orientation, and it would be different here.
It would be interesting to see if an environmental conservative who's out there, screaming in front of a bulldozer has the same kind of brain as a conservative who's out there clutching his gun and saying, "Don't have the government come and take it."
Well, I think I really believe in this amygdala stuff because, with all due respect to Mr. Trudeau, but I just think that makes sense to me. The fear part of it, anything that has to do with fear, I think is mediated through the amygdala, and so if I got a gun in my hand, my amygdala is probably pumping out a bunch of dopamine. So that's what I think.
But it might just not be put straight to a political party. It might just be your kind of way of thinking, even though it might drive you to a completely different conclusion.
Well, once you have this outlook on life, that your brain is giving you this outlook, everything is seen through that lens. So, like I said, I can see a news event through my lens, and a person of another political stripe would see it through their lens, and we're starting with the same facts, and we argue facts. It still doesn't lead to a resolution.
Well,
Thank you.